What up, nerds? Today marks the 10th day of the 31 days of Halloween, and with that in mind, we're taking a look at a subgenre of horror that explores multiple different types of horror games. Yep, we're taking a look at first-person horror games. The greatest thing about first-person horror games is that it explores just about every single style out there. From horror walking simulators that focus primarily on immersion and atmospheric horror, to action horror games that take the FPS genre and give it a horror flair. There's honestly a first-person horror game for everybody out there. For this list, I'll be featuring all my personal favorite first-person horror games regardless of style and subgenre, but again, it's worth noting that this is my personal list. So don't be too upset if your favorite doesn't crack my list. Believe it or not, it was a lot harder to get this list down to just 10 games. Also, to keep things interesting, I only feature one horror game per franchise. Before we get started though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel for more survival horror content. Also hit the like button if you enjoyed today's topic. Finally, this video is officially sponsored by G Fuel, so if you're looking for ways to support the channel, consider picking up your favorite tub of G Fuel using the link below or the code NerdSpaceGames at checkout to save up to 20% off your next order. Anyway, my name is Ruben with NerdSpace Games, and this is my top 10 best first-person horror games. Let's get it. Number 10, Soma. Frictional games are known for developing mind-blowing psychological first-person horror games, so it shouldn't be too shocking to see at least one of them on today's list. However, Soma is one that leans much more into the sci-fi horror genre compared to the rest of the games created by this development team, and it's easily one of the most intriguing first-person horror games ever created. From a story point of view, it explores themes that really forces us to question who we are and what really makes each of us who we actually are. From a gameplay point of view, the somewhat abandoned underwater facility that's slowly breaking apart creates a lot of tension throughout the entire experience. While the gameplay doesn't match most of the other entries on today's list, the atmospheric immersion and the story is top notch here, and those traits alone make Soma one of the most exciting and immersive first-person horror games out there. Number 9, Left 4 Dead 2. While nowhere near as scary as the rest of the horror games on today's list, Left 4 Dead 2 is an asymmetrical and co-op horror game that pits 4 survivors against an endless horde of zombies and special infected. While playing the campaigns of this game with your friends is fun enough, Left 4 Dead really stands out as a masterpiece because of the asymmetrical online versus mode in which another team of 4 controls special infected. During each chapter of the current campaign, both teams will have the opportunity to play as the infected and the survivors. This creates a unique experience that, while others have tried, no other game has completely captured the same vibe as the Left 4 Dead games. Outside of some of the Resident Evil games, I'm pretty confident in saying that Left 4 Dead might very well be my most played game of all time. Even decades later, the online servers are still active and full of people playing through the campaigns, and that just goes to show what a masterpiece Left 4 Dead 2 really is. Side note, I chose Left 4 Dead 2 because at a later date, all the content from the first game was also added to this game. Plus, I like a lot of the campaigns better in Left 4 Dead 2, so there's that too. Number 8, System Shock 2. It's kind of crazy how well sci-fi horror and first-person horror goes together, considering the fact that we already had one entry that fits that description in the form of Soma, and now we have another. System Shock 2 is kind of a melting pot of horror subgenres, honestly. It combines FPS, sci-fi horror, and RPG elements, which gives us one of the most unique first-person horror games ever created. While the first game is a masterpiece on its own, the second game far surpassed the original game in just about every single way. The atmosphere was more unnerving and terrifying, the enemy types were more challenging, and Shodan was, well, she was Shodan. Speaking of which, Shodan is what really makes the System Shock games elevate to a higher level of horror because of how unsettling she is. She spends a majority of her time taunting the player and deceiving us in ways that we couldn't possibly imagine until it's too late. Number 7, Amnesia The Bunker. One of the biggest debates when it comes to the Amnesia series is which game is the best game of the franchise, The Dark Descent or The Bunker. The Dark Descent clearly revolutionized the horror game industry and created a new subgenre of horror that would set the groundwork for a lot of horror games to follow in its footsteps, including a few games that appear higher on today's list. However, my personal preference for survival horror just pushes me towards Amnesia The Bunker as the best game of the franchise. Unlike every Amnesia game before, The Bunker wasn't your typical horror walking simulator. Instead, it leaned more towards survival horror by introducing weapons, limited resources, inventory management, limited saving, and much more. Plus, again, unlike the rest of the franchise, The Bunker added a level of unpredictability to the game while also introducing a semi-open world which allowed the game to feel less linear than other Amnesia games. The Beast, a relentless stalker enemy that pursued the player throughout the entire bunker, was unpredictable and almost reached the same highs as the Xenomorph and Alien Isolation. Almost being the key word there. The game would also reset puzzles and codes, making it impossible to memorize solutions for future playthroughs because it was always different. Also, since the beast was sensitive to light, one key element of the bunker was the generator. You would need to collect gas for the generator in order to keep the lights on, but on harder difficulties, you could also create limited saves by turning on the feature that will force you to use gas to save the game as well. In fact, the custom rules of the bunker allowed you to make the experience exactly how you wanted it to be. All in all, Amnesia the Bunker was one of my favorite survival horror games the year it came out, and for that reason, it's well deserving of its spot on today's list. Number 6. F.E.A.R. The first F.E.A.R. game to this day is one of the best FPS horror games ever created. There's so much to appreciate about both this game and its sequel, F.E.A.R. 2. However, in the case of which one is better, the first game far outshines the second, mostly thanks to the focus on atmospheric horror and the surprisingly impressive enemy AI. From the moment we're introduced to the main antagonist of the game though, Amma Wade, everything just builds and builds until it reaches a climax that is hard to top. Amma Wade is viewed as one of the best horror game antagonists despite taking the appearance of a young girl. The fact that she could just walk into a room or appear as you're going down a ladder and the entire atmosphere just instantly changes just goes to show how truly terrifying Amma Wade really was. I touched on this earlier, but also the enemy AI, especially for its time, was just extremely impressive. With the enemies constantly adapting to our gameplay style and communicating with each other to flank us, it created some of the most intense fight sequences. There's really a lot to love about F.E.A.R. from the game's main antagonist to the amount of jump scares to the enemy AI to the creepy set pieces to the tragic and intriguing story of F.E.A.R. This game definitely deserves a spot in the top 10 best first-person horror games of all time. Number 5. Outlast. Breaking the list for the top 5 first-person horror games, we now take a look at arguably one of the scariest horror games of all time. Yeah, the first Outlast game still leaves me with nightmares just thinking about it. While we've experienced stalker enemies and first-person horror walking simulators before, Outlast found ways to test those boundaries and create unique experiences that far surpasses most games of the genre. Set inside of an insane asylum, Mount Massive was full of disturbed patients, ready to attack and scare the living hell out of any player that enters the asylum. All you brought with you was your camera, and this camera would be your main source of light whenever you found yourself in dark places. The camera created a found footage vibe, which again wasn't something that we were familiar with much at the time. However, the true MVPs of this game were the main stalker enemies. Chris Walker is easily one of the most terrifying stalker enemies ever created, as he will relentlessly pursue you throughout the entire asylum. Traeger is a disturbed individual who makes the most of his short time on screen. Even the Whistleblowers DLC is terrifying and memorable, and it also features another one of the best stalker enemies in all horror games, the Groom. There's not really many negatives I can say about Outlast, hence why it's so high on my list of best first-person horror games of all time. Number 4. Visage. If Outlast was one of the scariest first-person horror games I've ever played, then Visage is probably the game that claims that title for me, and it's honestly not even close. Which shouldn't be too shocking, as Visage takes a lot of inspiration from PT in the way that it follows a protagonist that finds himself trapped inside of a house who is pursued by ghosts and demons. Because of the set design of the house combined with the ghosts and demons stalking the player, Visage is easily one of the more unnerving horror games out there. Even the story and cutscenes are terrifying in this game, as Dwayne, the main protagonist, will often find himself coming face to face with things straight out of your worst nightmares. Since I have this game and Outlast back to back, I feel like I should explain why I put Visage higher than it. 1, as I already said, I find Visage to be scarier than Outlast. 2, the story of Visage is deeper and more unnerving than the story of Outlast, although both are pretty close together in that department. 3, I love the focus on puzzles in Visage. Despite being pursued by different ghosts and demons throughout the game, you still have to solve puzzles in order to complete the different chapters. And speaking of which, that's another thing that I actually like better about Visage. The way the game is broken up into different stories and the player could choose what order they want to complete the game created a less linear experience compared to Outlast. There's other things I really liked about Visage better than Outlast, including the use of a sanity gauge in Visage, but when all is said and done, Visage is deserving of its spot as the 4th best first-person horror game of all time. Number 3. Condemned Criminal Origins. As we break the top 3 first-person horror games, you'll notice these 3 games are a lot different from each other. This just goes to show how unique first-person horror games are, and Condemned Criminal Origins is one of those games that is unlike anything else. While the game doesn't focus as much on supernatural enemies or alien creatures like other entries on today's list, at least not until near the end of the game, Criminal Origins still somehow takes the gritty noir vibe of the game and creates one of the best horror experiences ever created. The game challenges you to track a serial killer who is killing other serial killers, but has framed you for the murder of 2 cops. However, this journey leads you down a dark and twisted path featuring plenty of jump scares, terrifying environments, and different maniacs. Perhaps the scariest moment in the game? No, wait, I take that back. Perhaps the scariest area in all horror games period is Bart's department store. In this location, Ethan comes across maniacs that dress as mannequins and disguise themselves as displays scattered throughout the store. This allows them to sneak up on you and even whisper creepy things to you without you knowing exactly where they are hiding. This sequence is just one example of why Condemned is one of the scariest and challenging horror games out there, and it definitely deserves to be in the top 3 best first-person horror games of all time, that's for sure. Number 2, Alien Isolation. Alien Isolation is the best in a lot of areas. Best sci-fi horror game, best stalker enemy in a horror game, one of the scariest horror games, best enemy AI. The list goes on in terms of why Alien Isolation is a masterpiece. The game features survival horror traits with limited resources and weapons to deal with the androids and psychos in the space station to an unlikable stalker that literally adapts to your every move. Seriously, the Xenomorph is easily the most terrifying stalker enemy ever created, as it learns from you over time and eventually it learns how to beat you at your own game. When facing off against a Xenomorph, you can't hide in the same places or keep playing the same way that you normally do. Instead, you will have to change up your strategy and be unpredictable, because if you're not, the Xenomorph will learn your tricks and stop you with tricks of its own. I can't tell you how many times the Xenomorph scared the living daylights out of me, and exploring the space station when all you hear are sounds in the vents as it's moving around the station is easily one of the most unnerving experiences ever in a horror game. Number 1, Resident Evil 7. Am I biased? Probably. Do I care? Not one bit. I'm sorry, out of every first-person horror game out there, none of them comes remotely close to how many times I replay Resident Evil 7. That's because I feel like Resident Evil 7 takes the best parts out of all the horror games that appear on today's list, well, most of them, and then combines those traits to create the masterpiece that is RE7. You have stalker enemies, specifically Jack Baker, that rivals the Xenomorph to some degree. Survival horror elements are front and center here too, with limited resources, inventory management, and even limited saves if you're playing on Madhouse mode. RE7 is also viewed as one of the scariest horror games of all time, in my opinion. In fact, there's not many horror games that can top it in terms of the scare factor. It takes a lot of inspiration from PT, like Visage did, but adds its own survival horror and action horror elements to it in different sections of the game. As with any of the later Resident Evil games, you also have a very captivating story, and one of which connects the player with a protagonist that they could relate more to compared to badass fist-fighting heroes like Leon and Chris. I mean, I could go on and on about what makes Resident Evil 7 so perfect, and it's for all of those reasons I just mentioned and many, many more as to why RE7 claims the title, for me at least, as best first-person horror game of all time. Okay, alright, go ahead. Bring out the haters in the comments now. I'm ready, let's do it. But that does it for this episode of Nerd Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is Resident Evil 7 the best first-person horror game of all time, or is there a different horror game that deserves that title? Also, let me know which first-person horror game are you upset about not making my list. Honestly, there's a lot of games that just barely missed out on making my list, as it was very, very hard to narrow this list down to just 10 games. But I'm curious about which ones you think I should have included. Leave your thoughts down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more survival horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you really enjoyed today's topic. Well, thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Games. Take care.